The week that was.
And in the week that was today, we start off on rather a somber note. Chad, it's been a dark couple of days in the world. I think that everyone is talking about one story, and that is the story of George Floyd. And obviously, it's taken over the whole world and the whole of social media. And so we're going to start with this because we have to address it. We have to talk about it.
Definitely.
It's a big moment when we think about kind of the social progress we made as humanity and like what the next couple of years is going to look like. And I think what will help us start, Chad, is we'll talk through exactly what happened, the facts of the story, and then we can get into a bit more of our thoughts and opinions as to what's happened. So if you haven't heard, if you've been living under a rock, what happened was there was a viral video that was going around the internet. And the video was a shocking, horrendous, diabolical video of a US policeman kneeling on the neck of someone he had arrested, a man by the name of George Floyd, a black man. And George Floyd was arrested for using a counterfeit check in one of the grocery stores, was arrested, and then was, for 9 minutes, this policeman was shown kneeling on George Floyd's neck as he begged to be released, right? Unfortunately, after that whole process, George Floyd ended up in hospital in critical condition and ended up passing away. And so the video is absolutely shocking, and kind of a huge uproar that went up as soon as the video started to go viral about this. It's a murder, basically. It's a murder by the policeman on George Floyd, and it's kind of indicative of a lot of the police brutality we see in the United States for a long time. This kind of feels like the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, we've seen lots and lots of high-profile police shootings in America and police murders in America, especially of black people, and I think that this is kind of the last straw. And so what we saw was a huge uproar across the world, across America. We saw lots of violent protests, especially in Minneapolis, where this happened, but also across the states, in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in a bunch of different states, as well, Chad, as a few cities around the world. So I saw in Berlin, I saw in a couple of cities around the world. It really has become a global movement and a global conversation about the racism that is still present in our society, that is still kind of systemically involved in a lot of the developing world and the developed world. And for the US, this is a really, really bad time for this, because obviously we're coming through the pandemic, everyone is trying to deal with that, and now these riots and these kind of protests are taking place that are really pushing America to try and figure out what are they going to do about this. Obviously, it's a diabolical thing, and we're very happy to say that all four officers who were part of it were arrested, and the one who was kneeling on George Floyd's neck has been charged for murder. But this is not the beginning. This is not the end of the story, because of course we've seen lots of these in the past, and everyone is so gung-ho for justice. Everyone is hurting. Everyone is really feeling this emotionally, and it's been a really, really sad couple of days, Chad.
Absolutely tragic video. I mean, for a little while, I obviously saw all the posts coming around, and based on what people had said about the video, I kind of held off on looking at it, because it definitely does tug at your heartstrings. And I just had to, for the sake of getting full context and understanding of the story, had to watch the video. And I mean, those cries of his, absolute agony and just no compassion whatsoever by that policeman, really does, just as I said, tug the deepest heartstrings. And I just can't believe something like this is happening in today's day and age. And I'm just really pleased that somebody was there recording it, and that that little recording has really just sparked this conversation that, like you said, I think has been kind of bubbling underneath the surface for some time, and obviously has led to us talking about it now as well. But really tragic that a man who had allegedly done something has lost his life. Didn't get the chance to go to trial for whatever it is that he was accused of doing, and his life was robbed away from him prematurely, which is absolutely disgusting and really just sad.
Yeah, Chad, it really is a sad state of affairs. I mean, the fact that we're still dealing with this sort of thing, like years and years after the first kind of police brutality we saw in the States, and nothing has really changed, to be honest. That's why I think everyone is so angry and is so up in arms, is because we've seen time and time again examples of this, examples of police using like undue force and undue brutality on African Americans in the States, and for reasons that don't hold up, right? There's justifications that don't hold up. Like everyone understands that policing is a very difficult job. Like you don't actually know what's going on. Often there's a lot of fear there. There's a lot of anxiety. It is a difficult job. But some of these videos, and especially this one, and a lot of kind of these cases have just been absolute no-brainers. They've actually been like terrible things that have happened. And it kind of feels like the beginning of a revolution. If I look at social media right now, based on the kind of everything's happening in the States, every video I see is of people looting stores and of burning police stations and writing graffiti on CNN walls and all this kind of stuff. It really feels like the beginning of a revolution of sorts. And the black community is simply not going to sit down anymore and kind of take this. And more than that, I think around the world, people have been standing in solidarity with that community to say that this is not okay and to really denounce this sort of violence and to denounce this overt racism that still exists in our society. It is such a sensitive topic because, of course, slavery of the past and kind of the injustice of the past is still quite fresh in our memories, even though it was a generation or two ago. And when we see something like this, it kind of harks back to that past. And we'd like to think that we're past that. We'd like to think that we are more united in society. We'd like to think that we've made lots of progress. But examples like this really put the spotlight as to whether we have actually made that progress. And so the movement of Black Lives Matter, the movements of these sort of social progress kind of discussions is very important to have, both for the black community, but also for people like us, Chad, white people who are in privileged positions, who have like all the opportunities in the world, to ensure that we stand up with those people and really make it clear that every human is equal and every human has value regardless of their circumstances, regardless of their color, regardless of any of that. And that's an important message we have to carry forward, and that's kind of hope we have to carry forward. Right now, it feels a little bit hopeless. It feels a little bit like pessimistic, right? When you look at what's happening. And as a society, as people, as compassionate human beings, we have to believe we can move past this. We have to believe that this might be the start of that change, and we can start moving towards a more equal society.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Barry. I think this definitely does feel like the beginning of something that is, significant and something that will hopefully not just fade away in a few weeks, months, years' time. I suppose when it comes to our generation, it does seem like we have been the generation to tackle these kinds of topics that have, really not been focused on enough in the previous generations. Things like climate change as well, and obviously, something as important as racism, which, like you said, I think is undeniably evident everywhere around the world. And it's one of those topics that for a long time has been taboo. Like we've discussed before, there's a load of emotion behind it from all sides of the argument. And I think now we're at the point where people are really just putting through sort of objective evidence, and everyone is stepping back and saying, let's look at the facts as they are. Let's look at what has happened, and this is wrong. No matter where you stand, no human being could say, no, well, that's fine. What happened is fine. It's so wrong. And I think that's what's so great to see, is that everyone is uniting now at this point. And I just hope that it will carry on going, this movement, and that this conversation doesn't just flare up and kind of fade away into the distance again.
I think it's a very important point, Chad. I think there's so much emotion right now. And kind of if you look at the way that the media is set up and social media is set up, it's designed to hype up moments like this, to really make it number one trending topic everywhere. But we've seen time and time again, after a few days or a few weeks, it kind of fades out into the distance and we start to forget about it because the news cycle is so short. And that's what I'm worried about. In order to see real sustainable change, we need to move beyond the petitions and the likes on Facebook and kind of the solidarity shown on social media. And we need to be able to carry these conversations into our circles, into our friends and our family, into our communities. And that's when I start to worry about whether all of this emotion gets in the way of making long-term sustainable change, right? At the moment, with so much emotion and so much kind of heartache and suffering, it's hard to think of what is the right plan to move forward. How do you plot and strategize and try and get rid of some of these systemic pieces of oppression and pieces of racism? And so what I'm hoping, Chad, is that this movement is not simply a social media frenzy for no reason, and that it actually continues. And it's incumbent on all of us to take this forward. I was having a chat with a friend yesterday and saying that it's all of our responsibilities, no matter what color you are, no matter what background you have, to take these conversations seriously, to move them away from being taboo, like you were saying, and actually bring them into the light, because that's how we move society forward. That's what social progress is made of. It's made of individuals deciding to take whatever they can, whatever communities, whatever people they can influence, and pull them onto the right path, the ethical path. And so I, for one, am hoping that happens. And Chad, I'm trying to find ways of how to make sure that happens in my own life. I've been trying to think of, beyond just saying things on social media, beyond just writing a post about it, beyond any of that, What can I do in my own life? And I'd like to encourage anyone listening or anyone watching right now is to do some real introspection and think about what you can do in your own life, in your own communities, to do your part. Because the kind of actions that we take after this frenzy has died down is really going to be indicative of what kind of people we are and what kind of world we want to live in.
Completely agree there, Barry. It's all very well to talk the talk, but until you actually do the walking, nothing actually practically is going to change. And so I really like that angle, and I've certainly seen from the posting that has been going up around. There's been even a couple of posts that say, if you're silent, you're complicit, and all of those kinds of things to kind of try and make you feel guilty, I suppose. Unless you put something up, and for me, that's not progress. Progress is people who genuinely want to see change, putting things up because they actually want to, be a part of this, and actually taking it further than putting something up on social media, and actually, going into their circle of friends, filtering out the messages that need to be done, and ultimately, drawing this conversation further to its closure.
I completely agree there. And I don't think guilt is an effective mechanism for change here.
Yep.
Like, guilt is not the way we should be going, right? We should be trying to find areas of similarity, areas of solidarity. I think for us in our position, we need to be listening to kind of the voices of the Black community and listening to the suffering and trying to be empathetic with them. But like you say, it's not about guilting people into pretending they believe in something. It's about trying to imagine what is the vision for the world you want to live in. Like, when you have children one day, what kind of world do you want them to inhabit? And what kind of actions can you take as an individual to move in that direction? And so I agree with you. I think that the guilt thing is real right now on social media. If you go on and you see all your friends posting about it, all of the media posting about it, all the celebrities posting about it, there's that need to almost be a part of that. And as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, I think it's great, and I think it's important. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, it doesn't matter what you do on social media. It doesn't matter what your Instagram looks like. What matters is in your own life, in your interactions with people of different backgrounds and different diverse kind of places. How are you treating those people? How are you ensuring that everyone is taken seriously and is respected like they should be? And just your general humanity. I mean, we're going to come to the space launch just now, and like the humanity that we all share is so powerful if we get it right. If we're able to collaborate and to really take diversity seriously, we can achieve incredible things. And so it's in all of our interests to really push this narrative and to really make that change happen in our individual lives. And it needs to go beyond social media.
Well, before we move on, let's just quickly touch on Trump and, the kind of controversy that's been surrounding him throughout this whole incident and everything else that's been unfolding. He has obviously taken to Twitter, as he always does when anything is going on, and, very quick, hot-headedly, bashes out these tweets that really just do rub people up the wrong way, because they are just not thought out carefully enough before he tweets them out. So the tweets I'm talking about is, one where he refers to people who are doing looting as thugs. He also refers to, policemen as good people. And, this message that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Is it just me, Barry, or are people not really reading between the lines? But it seems fairly overt.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, Chad. That kind of tweet really shook the world and shook the community in this discussion. Obviously, he backtracked after the backlash and kind of came back and said he was out of context, and he gave this whole explanation for it. But when I read that tweet, I don't see how you can see it any other way. He really was provoking people, and I think it's very dangerous for the president of the United States. I mean, we've seen a lot from Trump, right? We've seen a lot of crazy things from his Twitter accounts, but this feels like something that could really be a real dent in his election hopes. Because in a moment like this, where you want your leader to stand up and really speak for what's right and wants to really be a charismatic figure who really pulls the country together, he just sowed more discord with this tweet, and it's really horrible to see. And I think why it was so monumental, Chad, is because basically he was glorifying violence, at least in Twitter's eyes, right? So Twitter made a very big decision to censor his tweet for the very first time, and put a little a briefing over the tweet saying, listen, this tweet violates our terms of service because it glorifies violence, but we believe in the public interest to still be able to show you the tweet. So you had to click on it to see the tweet actually happen. And this is the first time they censored, and he said some crazy stuff in the past, but this is the first time they really had the soft censorship. And it opened a whole new can of worms as to what is Twitter's role in all of this? What is social media's role in kind of managing the public conversation and managing very difficult topics like this? Trump fired back, wanting to throw regulation at them, wanting to punish them for censoring him. But at the same stage, like Twitter really showed that they are trying to do the best for the public good and and it's a big statement because Trump is probably the number one user. It's probably the number one draw card to Twitter right now. He's got 80 odd million followers and has the whole world looking at him at every single moment in time. And so it's a tweet that was really, really poor from his perspective. It really showed, it looked bad from an American perspective. And hopefully this is my personal opinion here, but hopefully this will begin to really dent his election hopefuls. And hopefully we can get a real adult into that office in the next election.
Yep. That would certainly be a good thing for the whole world. I think that moment to censor a tweet like this is an important one. We saw Zuckerberg sitting in Congress and testifying various things, and I think it's because of these types of actions that are required that, in hindsight, do actually pass through, I suppose, an ordinary man kind of street test, with whether this was a reasonable thing to do. And I think it was a reasonable thing to do. The fact that they still kept it on there for public interest also really importantly showcases what their purpose is and, what it is that the platform is trying to do. Last thing I wanted to chat about, Barry, is just in terms of the protests turning violent. It seems like whenever there are these kinds of big messages, for some reason, it requires this change to violence for people to actually take notice. What is it, do you think, that actually flicks that switch, from peaceful to violent?
This is a really difficult topic because I think that it's hard to understand exactly what's going on in those protests, right? I think we saw it in South Africa as well. We've seen protests here in South Africa. There's often a small contingent that makes things violent. Often, like, the movement is non-violent and the movement is in the right spirit. But with anything like this, you kind of attract some of the wrong people. And so there's some bad apples who see it as an opportunity to take things to the next level and kind of push the boundaries of what is possible. And so it's hard to know exactly what proportion of that contingent has been violent. I mean, the looting of the shops and all that has been horrible, right? It's been terrible to see. And it's hard to know, does that represent the movement itself, or is it just a few bad apples within those movements? But beyond that, I think if we look back at history and look back at some of the revolutions we've seen, it feels like it requires some sort of violence for the elitists or kind of the governments to really take notice. And that's a really sad state of affairs.
Definitely.
When you actually aren't listening to your people until they destroy things, until they kind of really force you to listen because they go beyond the law. And so there's a really interesting ethical debate here as to whether that violence is for the greater good. If it brings about the change that we want to see in the world, then perhaps it is justified, right? But at the same time, we don't want to set the precedent that violence is okay or that looting is okay no matter what your cause is, because that's a very dangerous precedent to set. And so I don't know where I stand on it. I flip-flop between the two extremes and find it very difficult to understand what's going on. I think that social media will definitely hype up the violence because that's what sells ads and that's what gets clicks. So that's all you're going to see on social media. But unless you're actually there at the protest and you really understand what is going on, it's hard to say. I mean, I've seen videos of protesters protecting shop owners and getting in the way of their fellow protesters and telling them, no, we're not going to destroy this, we're not going to burn this down, etc., etc. And so it is a really difficult one, Chad, and I don't quite know how to answer it.
Yeah, it really, really is such a tricky topic. And I suppose that's just the point that I was going to bring is that it seems like, for there to be notice, for there to be conversation, it requires this sort of insane, out of control spectacle. And that is such a strange phenomenon, I suppose. The one thing that it does do, though, unfortunately for the event that just happened, is it doesn't really show George Floyd off in the best possible way. A man who had a very loving family, and there's a family that's grieving really at the moment, and the world that's grieving through his loss. But to see that loss out in this kind of way is probably not the best way that people would want to remember him.
Yeah, definitely not. And it can be argued that it sets the movement back a little bit, right, if it gets out of hand, because it kind of sets the wrong example and really shows a potential side of the movement that maybe shouldn't be explored, right, or shouldn't be seen. Of course, you are mourning, you're grieving, and so much of this comes from an emotional response. So much of this comes from the anger and the heartache and the sadness and the grief from a moment like this. And that's why it's so difficult to kind of detach your emotions from the situation and try and figure out what is the best for the movement. How do you actually positively impact it? How do you use George Floyd and use his memory and kind of his legacy, which is now going to go forward forever, and use that name to push that movement forward? And I don't think violent protests do it. But at the same time, what else can you do? How many more peaceful protests are we going to have, right? How many more petitions do you have to sign, etc., etc.? At the end of the day, these people want justice. They want things to change. They want a better society and a better world. And so, yeah, it's such a hard one, Chad.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see some change and meaningful change in the coming years.
Across the pond.